a 78-year-old man stood in a courtroom in Marion County, Indiana, wearing the only suit he still owned. It was navy blue, 30 years old, pressed carefully the night before by hands that no longer held steady. Pinned above his left breast pocket was a pale blue ribbon holding a 5-pointed star. The judge looked down from the bench, adjusted his glasses and said, "Sir, remove that costume jewellery. This is a court of law, not a costume party." The old man said nothing. He simply placed his hand over the medal the way a father covers a sleeping child. What happened next silenced every person in that courtroom and brought a 4-star general through those double doors. If this story moves you, comment the word honour right now, and stay with me until the end. His name was Arthur Ray Dunham, born in 1947 in a clapboard house outside of Terre Haute, Indiana, the youngest of 4 boys raised by a widowed mother who cleaned offices at night and took in laundry during the day. Arthur never knew his father, a steel worker who died from a fall at the Wabash River Bridge construction site 3 months before Arthur was born. His mother, Lorene, kept a single photograph of the man on the mantel, and Arthur grew up studying that face the way other boys studied baseball cards. His father wore a serious expression, a white t-shirt, and a look in his eyes that seemed to say he already knew his time was going to be short. Lorene never remarried. She told her boys that their father had been the kind of man who showed up every single day, no matter how tired he was, no matter how cold the morning. She said that was what a man was supposed to do. Arthur took those words and carried them the way some people carry scripture. He was not a remarkable student. He was quiet in school, average in his grades, and overlooked by teachers who had bigger classes and louder children to worry about. But Arthur had a quality that would later define his life and nearly end it. He paid attention. He noticed things other people missed. A shift in someone's tone, a sound that did not belong, a shadow where there should have been light. His brothers called him the Watcher, and they meant it as a gentle tease, but it was the most accurate description anyone would ever give him. When Arthur was 18, in the spring of 1965, he walked into the Army recruiting office in downtown Terre Haute and enlisted. His mother did not cry. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and handed him a brown paper bag with 2 ham sandwiches and an apple. At the bus station, she held his face in both her hands and said, "You come back to me, Arthur Ray." He promised her he would. Basic training at Fort Knox was a blur of Kentucky heat and shouting drill sergeants, and learning to do things with a rifle that would have horrified his Sunday school teacher. Arthur was not the fastest or the strongest in his platoon, but he was the most observant. His drill instructor, a staff sergeant named Mitchell, noticed this early. During a night navigation exercise, Arthur was the only trainee who realized the compass heading they had been given was deliberately wrong, a test within the test. He corrected course without saying a word, led his fire team to the objective, and was sitting there waiting when the rest of the platoon arrived 40 minutes later. Staff Sergeant Mitchell pulled him aside afterward and said, "Dunham, you have eyes that work. Most of these boys just have eyes that see." Arthur did not fully understand the compliment at the time, but he would come to understand it in the months ahead in ways that would mark him forever. By early 1966, Arthur was in Vietnam. He was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and stationed at a forward operating base near the Iron Triangle, a dense, heavily fortified area of jungle northwest of Saigon that was a stronghold for Viet Cong operations. The base was little more than a collection of sandbag bunkers, concertina wire, and red mud that clung to everything. Arthur's platoon conducted daily patrols through terrain so thick with vegetation that sunlight only reached the ground in thin, fractured beams. The heat was a living thing. It pressed against your chest and crawled inside your helmet and made your thoughts slow and heavy. Insects the size of a man's thumb landed on exposed skin without warning. Leeches attached themselves to ankles and necks and had to be burned off with cigarettes. The smell was a mixture of rotting vegetation, diesel fuel, and something sweet and terrible that Arthur eventually learned was the scent of death, lingering in places where bodies had been but were no longer visible. Arthur's ability to notice what others missed quickly became critical. He could detect the faint disturbance of a recently placed tripwire by the way the surrounding leaves were bent. He could hear the difference between the sound of wind moving through bamboo and the sound of a man trying to move through bamboo without being heard. Within 3 months, he had been moved to point position on nearly every patrol, the most dangerous spot in the column, the first man to walk into whatever was waiting, He did not volunteer for this. He was assigned to it because his lieutenant understood that Arthur's eyes gave the entire platoon a better chance of surviving each mission. Arthur accepted this without complaint. He understood the math of it. If he saw the danger first, more of his brothers came home. And they were his brothers. Not by blood, but by something that ran deeper than blood. A bond forged in shared terror and exhaustion, and the knowledge that the man next to you was the only barrier between you and the void. The day that would define Arthur Dunham's life began like most others. September 14th, 1967. His platoon moved out at dawn on a routine sweep through a sector that intelligence had flagged as low threat. 26 men walking single file through a trail that wound through stands of rubber trees and patches of elephant grass, tall enough to swallow a man whole. Arthur was on point, his rifle up, his eyes moving in the pattern he had taught himself, left to right, ground to canopy, near to far, always moving. 30 minutes into the patrol, he stopped. No one had told him to stop. He just stopped. The men behind him froze in place because they had learned to trust Arthur's instincts the way a sailor trusts a lighthouse. Something was wrong. Arthur could feel it before he could see it. The jungle was too quiet. The insects had stopped. The birds had gone silent. In Vietnam, silence was never peace. Silence was a warning. Arthur raised his fist slowly, the signal to halt. He lowered himself to one knee and studied the trail ahead. It looked normal. Red dirt, scattered leaves, a fallen branch. But something in the geometry was off. The fallen branch was too straight. It had not fallen. It had been placed. Arthur's eyes followed the branch to a thin strand of monofilament fishing line, nearly invisible, running from the branch to a cluster of vegetation on the left side of the trail. Behind that vegetation, he could just make out the curved edge of a claymore mine, its face aimed directly at the kill zone where his platoon would have walked. But that was not all. The claymore was the bait. As Arthur scanned wider, he saw them. Fighting positions dug into the tree line on both sides of the trail, camouflaged with fresh-cut branches. This was not a single mine. This was a full ambush. An L-shaped kill zone designed to funnel the platoon into a crossfire from which there would be no escape. Later estimates would put the enemy force at over 60 fighters. Arthur's platoon had 26 men. What happened next took less than 4 minutes but would replay in Arthur's mind for the rest of his life. He turned to signal his lieutenant, but at that exact moment, a young Viet Cong fighter in one of the forward positions panicked and opened fire prematurely. The ambush was triggered before the platoon was fully inside the kill zone. Rounds ripped through the vegetation. The man directly behind Arthur, a 20-year-old from Ohio named Danny Whitfield, was hit in the shoulder and went down. The platoon scattered for cover, but in the chaos several men ran forward, directly toward the concealed positions. Arthur did not take cover. In the time it took his brain to process what was happening, his body was already moving. He sprinted forward along the left side of the trail, firing into the nearest fighting position. He killed 2 enemy fighters at close range and threw a grenade into a second position. The explosion silenced the machine gun that had been raking the trail with fire. Then Arthur did something that no training manual would ever recommend and no rational calculation would ever support. He kept going. He moved along the enemy line, position by position, firing, throwing grenades, and drawing the concentrated attention of the entire ambush force onto himself. His platoon leader, Lieutenant James Kessler, would later write in his after-action report that Specialist Dunham's actions were beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. He drew enemy fire deliberately, allowing the rest of the platoon to reorganize, establish a base of fire, and begin a flanking maneuver. During this action, Arthur was wounded 3 times. The first round struck him in the left forearm, shattering the radius bone. He switched his rifle to his right hand and continued. The second wound was shrapnel from a grenade that peppered his left side and leg with fragments of hot metal. He kept moving. The third wound, a round that passed through the muscle of his right thigh, finally brought him to the ground. But even then, from a prone position in the dirt, bleeding from 3 wounds, Arthur continued to fire, providing cover as his platoon completed the flanking maneuver that broke the ambush. When the firing stopped, 9 enemy fighters were dead in the positions Arthur had assaulted alone. The total enemy casualties from the engagement exceeded 30. Arthur's platoon had suffered 4 wounded, including Arthur himself. No one was killed. In a war where ambushes of that scale routinely wiped out entire platoons, not a single American died that day. And every man in that platoon knew exactly why. Lieutenant Kessler called in a medevac helicopter, and as the medic worked on Arthur's wounds, Kessler knelt beside him in the blood-soaked dirt and said, "Arthur, what you just did was the bravest thing I have ever seen." Arthur, fading in and out of consciousness, looked up at his lieutenant and asked, "Did everybody make it?" That was his only question. Not about his own wounds, not about what would happen next, just whether his brothers were alive. Arthur spent 4 months in military hospitals, first in Saigon, then in Japan, and finally at Walter Reed in Washington. The shattered bone in his forearm required 3 surgeries and never healed properly. His left hand would never again close into a full fist. The shrapnel in his side and leg caused chronic pain that would follow him for the rest of his life like a second shadow. But the deepest wounds were the ones no surgeon could reach. Arthur began having nightmares almost immediately. He would wake up in the hospital ward shouting warnings to men who were not there, reaching for a rifle that was not beside him. The faces of the men he had killed at close range visited him in his sleep. Not as enemies, as young men. Boys, really. Some of them could not have been older than 16. Arthur had done what he had been trained to do, what the situation required, what saved 25 lives. But knowing that did not stop the faces from coming. The Medal of Honor was presented to Arthur by President Lyndon Johnson in a ceremony at the White House on March 7, 1968. Arthur stood at attention in his dress uniform, his left arm still in a partial cast, while the president read the citation. The ceremony was attended by military officials, members of Congress, and Arthur's mother, Lorene, who had travelled to Washington for the first time in her life. She sat in the front row in a dress she had sewn herself, and when the president placed the medal around her son's neck, she pressed both hands against her mouth and wept silently. Arthur did not cry. He stared straight ahead with an expression that photographers would later describe as stoic. But those who knew him understood that he was somewhere else entirely. He was back in the jungle, in the red dirt, listening for the silence that meant danger. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Arthur how it felt to be a hero. Arthur looked at the man for a long moment and said, "The heroes are the ones who did not come home." Then he walked away. Arthur returned to Indiana and tried to build a life. He married a woman named Carol Ann Henderson in 1970, a nurse he had met during his rehabilitation at a VA hospital. They bought a small house on the east side of Indianapolis, not far from the old Chrysler plant. Arthur took a job as a maintenance worker at an elementary school, fixing leaky faucets and broken windows and making sure the boiler ran through the Indiana winters. He was good at the work. It kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He never spoke about Vietnam, not to Carol Ann, not to his co-workers, not to anyone. He kept the Medal of Honor in a wooden box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, behind a stack of old blankets. Carol Ann knew it was there but understood without being told that it was not something to be discussed. Arthur attended no veteran reunions. He joined no veteran organizations. When people asked if he had served, he would say yes and change the subject. He wanted to be a school janitor, a husband, eventually a father. He wanted to be ordinary, but the war would not let him be ordinary. The nightmares continued. They ebbed and flowed like a malevolent tide, sometimes retreating for weeks or even months, then returning with savage intensity. Arthur began drinking in the late 1970s, not heavily at first, a beer after work, then 2, then something stronger when the dreams were bad. Carol Ann watched the progression with growing alarm but did not know how to help a man who refused to acknowledge he needed help. They had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named James. Arthur loved them with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes frightened Carol Ann. He would check the locks on every door and window 3 times before bed. He would not allow the children to play in the front yard near the street. He built a fence around the backyard himself, 6 feet tall, solid wood, no gaps. He said it was for the dog they did not yet own. Carol Ann knew it was for something else entirely. The marriage lasted until 1986. Carol Ann did not leave because she stopped loving Arthur. She left because she was afraid that if she stayed, she would watch him disappear completely into whatever darkness was consuming him from the inside. The divorce was quiet and uncontested. Arthur gave her the house and most of what little money they had saved. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a barbershop on the south side of the city, and continued working at the school. He saw his children on weekends when the drinking did not interfere, which became less and less frequent as the years went on. Sarah stopped visiting when she was 16. James held on longer, driving over on Saturday mornings to sit with his father in the small apartment and watch football games on a television with a crooked antenna. But even James eventually pulled away, not from anger, but from the exhaustion of loving someone who seemed determined to let himself drown. By the time Arthur was in his 60s, the drinking had taken most of what the war had left. His health was poor, his liver was damaged, the chronic pain from his old wounds had worsened with age, and the VA healthcare system, overwhelmed and understaffed, provided care that was inconsistent at best. He had retired from the school on a small pension that barely covered his rent and medication. He moved from the apartment to a rented room in a boarding house, then to an even smaller room in a facility that called itself assisted living, but was really just a converted motel with a shared kitchen and a television in the common room. Arthur's world contracted year by year, room by room, until he occupied a space barely larger than the bunkers he had lived in half a century before. But through all of it, through every move and every loss, and every night when the walls of his room seemed to close in like the jungle canopy, Arthur kept the Medal of Honor. It was the one thing he never pawned, never lost, never left behind. He did not wear it, he did not show it to anyone, but he kept it in that same wooden box, tucked into whatever drawer or shelf his current dwelling provided, as though it were the last tether connecting him to a version of himself that still mattered. The events that led Arthur Dunham to that courtroom in Marion County began on a Tuesday in October. Arthur had been walking to the pharmacy 4 blocks from his residence to pick up a prescription for blood pressure medication. His route took him past a strip mall that housed a dollar store, a nail salon, and a check-cashing business. As he walked past the entrance to the dollar store, a young man came running out the door, collided with Arthur, and knocked him to the ground. The young man kept running. Arthur lay on the sidewalk, dazed, his hip throbbing from the impact. A store employee came out moments later, saw Arthur on the ground near the entrance, and made an assumption. She told the responding police officers that she had seen an older man near the door when the shoplifting occurred and thought he might have been involved. The actual shoplifter, a 22-year-old, was never caught. But Arthur Dunham, 78 years old, 140 pounds, with a barely functional left hand and a limp from wounds sustained in service to his country, was arrested for retail theft and conspiracy. The charges were absurd, and any competent investigation would have dismissed them within hours. But the system moved the way the system moves, with momentum that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with process. Arthur was booked, photographed, and released on his own recognizance. He was assigned a public defender, a young woman named Rebecca Torres, who was carrying 63 active cases and had exactly 12 minutes to review Arthur's file before their first meeting. She was sharp and well-intentioned, but overwhelmed. She told Arthur the charges would almost certainly be dropped at the preliminary hearing. Arthur nodded. He had survived things that would have destroyed most people. A misunderstanding in a courtroom did not frighten him. What happened in that courtroom, however, was something he had not anticipated. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Arthur dressed carefully. He put on the navy blue suit, the one he kept for funerals and the rare occasions when the world required him to present himself formally. He knotted his tie with one good hand and the partial grip of his damaged left, a process that took him nearly 15 minutes, and then, for the first time in decades, he opened the wooden box and took out the Medal of Honor. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a long time, the pale blue ribbon, the 5-pointed star with the figure of Minerva at its centre, the word valor inscribed on the bar above. He did not put it on for vanity. He did not put it on for attention. He put it on because he was walking into a room where people had already decided he was a criminal, and he needed to remind himself that he was not. He needed the weight of it against his chest, the way a man in deep water needs the feel of solid ground beneath his feet. He pinned the medal to his suit jacket and walked out the door. The courtroom was busy. It was a preliminary hearing docket, meaning the judge would see dozens of cases that morning, each one allotted only a few minutes. Arthur sat in the gallery and waited. When his name was called, he stood slowly, his hip protesting, and walked to the defendant's table, where Rebecca Torres was already standing with his file open. The judge, the Honourable Richard Wexler, was 54 years old, a former prosecutor known for running his courtroom with brisk efficiency and little patience for anything he perceived as theatrics, He had been on the bench for 11 years and had seen every trick defendants used to generate sympathy. He glanced down at Arthur's file, then looked up at Arthur, and his eyes went immediately to the medal on Arthur's chest. Judge Wexler's expression hardened. He leaned forward slightly, and what he said next would be heard by every person in that courtroom, remembered by many of them for years, and eventually seen by millions of people around the world. "Sir," the judge said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I'm going to need you to remove that pin from your jacket." Arthur looked up at the bench. He did not understand. Rebecca Torres leaned toward her client, equally confused. The judge continued, "This is a court of law. We deal in facts here, not in props designed to manipulate sympathy. I have seen defendants wear everything from clergy collars to military uniforms they purchased from surplus stores. Whatever that pin is, it has no place in these proceedings. Remove it now." The courtroom was quiet. Arthur's hand moved slowly to the medal but did not touch it. He simply rested his fingers near it, a protective gesture so instinctive it seemed involuntary. Rebecca Torres spoke up. "Your Honor, my client is a veteran. That medal is his personal property and I see no legal basis for requiring its removal." Judge Wexler looked at her with the expression of a man who had heard it all before. "Counselor, I have had defendants claim to be everything from decorated war heroes to ordained ministers. I am not questioning your client's service. I am maintaining the decorum of my courtroom. The pin comes off, or I will hold him in contempt." Arthur stood motionless. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the gallery a woman whispered to her companion. A bailiff shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Arthur looked at the judge for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. Every word carried the measured cadence of a man who had long ago learned that silence was more powerful than shouting. "Your Honor," Arthur said, "this is the Medal of Honor. It was presented to me by the President of the United States for actions in combat in the Republic of Vietnam on September 14th, 1967. I have carried it for 57 years. I will respectfully decline to remove it." The judge's face flushed. He was not accustomed to being defied, especially not by a defendant in a misdemeanor case. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a sound that made every head turn. The man who walked through those doors was tall, and moved with the upright posture of someone for whom good bearing was not a choice but a reflex. He wore the Army Service uniform, dark blue jacket and lighter blue trousers, and on his shoulders were 4 silver stars. His chest carried rows of ribbons that told the story of a career spanning nearly 4 decades. His name was Lieutenant General Thomas James Kessler. He was 69 years old, retired, and he had driven 3 hours from his home in Louisville, Kentucky, after receiving a phone call that morning from Arthur's son James, who had been contacted by Rebecca Torres after she realized what the medal on her client's chest actually was. James Kessler had been a 24-year-old lieutenant in the jungles of the Iron Triangle when Arthur Dunham saved his life, along with the lives of 24 other men. He had spent the subsequent decades rising through the ranks to 3-star general, and every promotion, every achievement, every day he had lived past September 14th, 1967, he attributed to the skinny kid from Terre Haute, who walked point and saw what nobody else could see. General Kessler did not ask for permission to approach. He walked down the centre aisle of the courtroom with a stride that made the bailiff instinctively step aside. Every eye in the room was on him. The 4 stars on his shoulders caught the overhead fluorescent light. He stopped at the bar that separated the gallery from the well of the court and looked directly at Judge Wexler. The judge stared back, visibly uncertain for what may have been the first time in his judicial career. Kessler's voice was not loud, but it filled the room the way a church bell fills a valley. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Lieutenant General Thomas James Kessler, United States Army, retired. I commanded soldiers in 4 theatres of conflict over 37 years of service. I am here because I received word that one of the bravest men this nation has ever produced is standing in your courtroom, being asked to remove the Medal of Honor." He paused. The silence was absolute. "That medal, Your Honor, is not a prop. It is not costume jewellery. It is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Fewer than 3,500 Americans have received it in the entire history of this nation. The man wearing it today earned it by single-handedly assaulting an enemy ambush line, destroying multiple fighting positions and sustaining 3 wounds in the process. all to protect the lives of the 25 men in his platoon. I know this because I was one of those 25 men. I was his platoon leader. I wrote the recommendation for that medal, and I am alive today because of what Arthur Dunham did." Judge Wexler sat motionless behind the bench. His mouth was slightly open. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning system was audible. General Kessler was not finished. "Your Honour, I do not presume to tell you how to run your courtroom, but I will tell you this. That medal is protected by federal law. Title 18, United States Code, Section 704, makes it a crime to wear or display the Medal of Honor without authorization. The fact that Mr. Dunham is wearing it is itself evidence that it is genuine, because no rational person would risk federal prosecution to wear a fake one into a courtroom. Furthermore, I can personally authenticate it. The medal number, the citation, the date of the action, the unit involved. I can verify every detail because I was there." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. "This is a copy of the original citation signed by the President of the United States. I have carried a copy of it for 57 years. Just as Arthur has carried the medal, I would like to submit it for the court's review." Rebecca Torres stood at the defense table with tears running silently down her face. She was not alone. In the gallery, several people were crying. A court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at the general with her hands suspended above the keys. The bailiff, a former Marine, had unconsciously straightened to a position approximating attention. Even the prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney named Michael Brennan, had closed his file and was watching with an expression that combined shock and something that looked very much like shame. Judge Wexler took the document from General Kessler's hand. He read it slowly. The citation described in formal military language exactly what Arthur had done on that September day in 1967. It described the ambush, the overwhelming enemy force, the single-handed assault on multiple positions, the 3 wounds, the refusal to stop fighting until his platoon was safe. It described a level of courage that most people encounter only in fiction. Wexler read it twice. When he looked up, his face had changed. The brisk authority was gone. In its place was something raw and human. "Mr. Dunham," the judge said. His voice was different now, quieter. The courtroom authority was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something that sounded like it was being forced through a constriction in his throat. "Mr. Dunham, I owe you an apology, not just as a judge, but as an American. I made an assumption based on appearances, and that assumption was wrong. I am ashamed of it." He paused, and in that pause the weight of what had nearly happened seemed to settle over the room like a physical thing. A 78-year-old man who had bled for his country had stood in an American courtroom and been told to remove the evidence of his valor because it was inconvenient to the proceedings. "I want the record to reflect," the judge continued, "that this court recognizes Arthur A. Dunham as a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and that this court extends its profound gratitude and respect for his service and sacrifice." Then Judge Wexler did something that no one in that courtroom expected. He stood up. In American courts, everyone rises when the judge rises. It is a gesture of respect for the authority of the bench. But Judge Wexler was not standing to exercise authority. He was standing to surrender it. He looked at Arthur Dunham and said, "In my courtroom, I ask people to rise for me. Today, I am rising for you." The courtroom erupted, not in applause, not at first, but in a collective sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, the sound of dozens of people simultaneously recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended the ordinary machinery of the legal system. Then the applause came, rolling through the gallery like thunder, and it did not stop for a long time. General Kessler walked to where Arthur was standing, and the 2 men faced each other. They had not been in the same room in over 40 years. Kessler was no longer the young lieutenant with mud on his boots and fear in his eyes. Arthur was no longer the sharp-eyed specialist who moved through the jungle like he was part of it. They were old men now, both of them, carrying the weight of years and the invisible scars of a war that their country had spent decades trying to forget. Kessler extended his hand. Arthur took it. Then Kessler did something that broke the last remaining composure in the room. He saluted. A 4-star general, standing in a civilian courtroom, rendered a formal military salute to a man in a threadbare blue suit. And Arthur Dunham, after a moment of stillness, straightened his back, lifted his chin, and returned it. The salute was held for several seconds. Neither man spoke. Neither man needed to. 57 years of shared history passed between them in that gesture, a history written in blood and terror, and the kind of brotherhood that only exists between men who have walked together through the valley of death and come out the other side. The prosecutor, Michael Brennan, stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honour," he said, "the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Dunham." He did not offer a legal rationale. He did not cite insufficient evidence or procedural deficiencies, though both existed in abundance. He simply asked for the charges to be dropped, and the tone of his voice made it clear that he understood the charges should never have been filed in the first place. Judge Wexler granted the motion immediately. "Case dismissed," he said. "And Mr. Dunham, you are free to go. You have always been free. This country owes you a debt it can never fully repay. You are dismissed from this court with the gratitude and respect of everyone in this room." Arthur nodded. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply nodded the way he had always nodded, with the quiet dignity of a man who had never asked for recognition and never expected it. But the story did not end when Arthur walked out of that courtroom. What happened in the days and weeks that followed revealed something about the power of a single moment of truth to change the trajectory of lives. Judge Wexler, by his own account in an interview he later gave to a local newspaper, went home that evening and sat in his study for 2 hours without moving. He said he kept seeing Arthur's hand move toward the medal, that protective gesture, and he kept hearing his own voice demanding its removal. He described it as the worst moment of his professional life. Within a month, Wexler had implemented new procedures in his courtroom, requiring that any defendant claiming veteran status be offered access to veteran support services before proceedings continued. He partnered with the local VA office and 2 veteran service organizations to create a referral program. He also began advocating for the establishment of a dedicated veterans court in Marion County, a specialized docket with judges trained to understand the unique challenges faced by veterans in the criminal justice system. Challenges that often stemmed not from criminal intent but from the lasting effects of service-related trauma. That Veterans Court was approved and operational within 18 months. General Kessler did not return to Louisville after the hearing. He drove Arthur to lunch at a diner near the courthouse, and the 2 men sat in a vinyl booth and talked for 3 hours. They talked about the men who had served with them, where they were now, who had survived, who had not. They talked about Danny Whitfield, the kid from Ohio who took the first round in the ambush and survived, and went on to become a high school football coach in Akron. They talked about Sergeant Nguyen, the South Vietnamese interpreter who had been with them on that patrol, and who had disappeared after the fall of Saigon and was never heard from again. They talked about the small things, the taste of sea rations, the weight of a pack in 90-degree heat, the sound of rain on a poncho liner. They did not talk about the killing. They did not need to. They both carried that in a place that words could not reach. When Kessler finally stood to leave, he gripped Arthur's shoulder and said, "I should have come sooner. I should have found you years ago." Arthur shook his head. "You're here now, Lieutenant," he said, using the rank Kessler had held when they served together. "That is what matters." Kessler's visit opened a door that had been closed for decades. He contacted other members of the platoon who were still alive, and within weeks, calls and letters began arriving for Arthur from men he had not heard from since the war. Some of them had wondered for years what had happened to the quiet kid from Indiana who had walked point and saved them all. Several had tried to find him over the years, but had lost the trail when Arthur's life contracted into smaller and smaller spaces. Now they found him, and the reconnection was like water reaching parched earth. Arthur's son James, who had made the phone call that brought Kessler to the courtroom, began visiting his father regularly again. He brought Arthur's grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl whom Arthur had seen only in photographs. The first time Arthur held his granddaughter, a 4-year-old named Lorene after his mother, he sat in a folding chair in the common room of his residence and held the child on his lap with his one good hand and his damaged one, and he cried. It was the first time James had ever seen his father cry. Arthur's daughter Sarah, who had pulled away as a teenager and built a life in Chicago, received a call from James telling her what had happened in the courtroom. She drove to Indianapolis the following weekend. She and Arthur sat together in his room, and she asked him why he had never told her about the medal, about what he had done. Arthur was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I did not want you to think about your father in that place. I wanted you to think about the man who fixed your bicycle and read you stories at bedtime. That was the man I wanted to be. The other one, the one who did what he did in the jungle, I tried to leave him over there." Sarah reached across and took his damaged hand in both of hers and held it. She did not say anything because she understood, perhaps for the first time, that her father's silence had not been absence. It had been protection. He had carried the weight alone so that his children would not have to feel it. The story of what happened in Judge Wexler's courtroom spread in the way that stories spread in the modern world, through social media posts and news articles, and the particular velocity that attaches to narratives about justice and redemption. Rebecca Torres, Arthur's public defender, wrote an account of the hearing that was published in the Indiana Lawyer, a legal journal. A reporter from the Indianapolis Star picked up the story and wrote a feature that ran on the front page. Within a week, the story had been covered by national outlets. The video of the hearing, recorded by the courtroom's standard audio-visual system, was obtained through a public records request and posted online, where it was viewed millions of times. People watched the moment when General Kessler walked through the doors. They watched the judge stand. They watched the salute between two old soldiers. And they responded with a force that surprised everyone, including Arthur. Donations poured into a fund established by James to improve his father's living situation. Within 3 months, Arthur was moved to a private room in a veteran-focused assisted living community with on-site medical care, counselling services, and a staff trained to work with aging combat veterans. The facility was called Patriot's Landing, and on the day Arthur moved in, the staff and residents lined the hallway and applauded as he walked to his new room. Arthur stopped halfway down the hall, overwhelmed, and General Kessler, who had driven from Louisville for the occasion, put a hand on his back and said, "Keep walking, Arthur. You have earned every step." Arthur's new room had a window that overlooked a garden. He placed the wooden box with the Medal of Honor on the nightstand beside his bed, where he could see it in the morning light. For the first time in years, it was not hidden away. It was simply there, part of the landscape of his life, no longer a secret and no longer a burden. Arthur began attending counselling sessions at the facility. He was diagnosed formally with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that had shaped his entire adult life but had never been named or treated. The counsellor, a Vietnam-era veteran herself, worked with Arthur gently and patiently, understanding that 57 years of silence could not be undone in a few sessions. Arthur's progress was slow but real. The nightmares did not disappear, but they became less frequent. He began sleeping through some nights for the first time in decades. He began talking, not about everything, not all at once, but in pieces, releasing fragments of the weight he had carried alone. He told his counsellor about the faces of the young men he had killed and how they visited him at night. She told him that carrying the faces was not guilt, it was grief, and grief, unlike guilt, was something that could be honoured rather than hidden. Arthur thought about that for a long time, and something in him shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a door opening half an inch to let in a thin line of light. One afternoon, about 4 months after the courtroom incident, Arthur was sitting in the garden at Patriot's Landing when a young man in army dress uniform walked through the gate. He was a staff sergeant, 27 years old, and he had driven from Fort Campbell to meet Arthur. He had seen the video of the courtroom online and had been so moved by it that he requested leave to make the trip. He found Arthur sitting in a plastic chair with a blanket over his legs, watching birds at a feeder that one of the nurses had hung from a nearby tree. The staff sergeant approached, stood at attention, and saluted. Arthur looked up at him with surprise. The young soldier held the salute until Arthur returned it, which he did instinctively, the muscle memory of decades overriding his momentary confusion. Then the staff sergeant pulled up a chair and sat down, and he said, "Sir, I just needed to meet the man who did what you did. I needed to shake your hand and tell you that your example matters. It matters to me, and it matters to every soldier serving today." Arthur shook the young man's hand, and they talked for an hour. The staff sergeant was on his 3rd deployment. He had his own nightmares. He had his own faces. And sitting with Arthur, talking to a man who had carried those things for more than half a century and was still here, still breathing, still putting one foot in front of the other, gave the young soldier something he had not had before. He called it hope. That visit was not the only one. In the months that followed, soldiers and veterans from across the country made their way to Patriot's Landing to meet Arthur Dunham. Some came in uniform, some came in jeans and work boots, some came alone and some came with their families. They came because Arthur's story had become something larger than one man's experience. It had become a mirror in which they could see their own struggles reflected and recognised. Arthur did not seek this role. He had never sought any role beyond doing what needed to be done, but he accepted the visitors with the same quiet grace he had carried through his entire life, shaking hands, listening to their stories, offering the kind of sparse, weighted words that meant more than any speech. He told one young veteran, a woman who had served in Afghanistan and was struggling with the transition home, "The war does not end when you leave, it follows you, but you are stronger than it is. I know that because you are here, and being here takes more courage than anything I ever did in that jungle." The woman wept. Arthur handed her a tissue from his pocket and said nothing else, because he understood that some pain simply needs to be witnessed, not fixed. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Arthur's entire family gathered at Patriot's Landing for a photograph. It was the first time the whole family had been in one place in over 20 years. Arthur sat in the centre in a wheelchair, wearing his blue suit and the Medal of Honor. His daughter Sarah stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. His son James stood on the other side with his wife and 3 children. Carol Ann, his ex-wife, now 72, had come too. She stood slightly apart from the group until Arthur looked at her and said, "Carol, you belong in this picture." She stepped forward, and when the photographer snapped the image, she was holding Arthur's damaged left hand. The photograph was later framed and hung on the wall of Arthur's room, next to the window that overlooked the garden. When visitors asked about it, Arthur would say, "That is my platoon. Different war, same mission." And he would smile, one of the few smiles that ever reached his eyes. Arthur Ray Dunham spent the final chapter of his life not as a forgotten man in a shrinking room, but as a man surrounded by people who understood what he had given and what it had cost. He never became comfortable with the word hero. He never stopped believing that the true heroes were the ones who did not come home. But he allowed himself finally to accept that what he had done mattered, that the lives he saved went on to create other lives and other stories, and that the ripples of a single act of courage can spread across decades in ways that no one can predict. General Kessler visited monthly. Danny Whitfield, the kid from Ohio, flew in twice. The platoon's surviving members held a reunion at Patriot's Landing, 8 old men sitting in a circle in the garden, sharing a silence that was more eloquent than any words. Judge Wexler came once, unannounced, and sat with Arthur for 30 minutes. He did not wear his robes. He came as a man, not a judge. He told Arthur that the Veterans Court was handling more than 200 cases a year, and that every one of those cases began because of what happened that day in his courtroom. Arthur nodded and said, "Then something good came from it." Wexler said, "Something good came from you, Mr. Dunham. Something good has always come from you." The story of Arthur Dunham is not just the story of a medal or a courtroom or a war fought half a century ago in a country 10,000 miles from Indiana. It is a story about what we owe to the men and women who serve. Not just gratitude, though gratitude is owed. Not just care, though care is desperately needed. What we owe them is sight, the willingness to look past appearances, past assumptions, past the comfortable shorthand we use to categorize the people around us, and to see the human being standing in front of us with all the weight of their history on their shoulders. Arthur Dunham walked into that courtroom carrying 57 years of service, sacrifice, pain, and quiet endurance. A judge looked at him and saw a defendant. A general looked at him and saw a brother. The difference between those two perspectives is the difference between a society that honours its promises and one that forgets them. Every day, in every city in this country, there are men and women like Arthur Dunham walking among us. They do not wear their medals. They do not tell their stories. They carry their burdens in silence because that is what they were trained to do, and because the world rarely asks them to do otherwise. This story is a reminder that asking matters, that seeing matters, that the old man in the threadbare suit might be the bravest person you will ever meet, and you will never know it unless you take the time to look.